Welcome to Chapter 9 on Friendship and Love. In this chapter, we'll be looking at why it is that we select the mates that we do. We'll be talking about initial attraction. We'll also be looking at what it is that causes us to stay in relationships. We'll examine what it is that contributes to friendship, and we'll be looking at gender differences in friendship and conflict resolution in friendship. We'll also be taking a look at some of the features that are related to attraction that are associated with culture. We'll also be looking at loneliness and the factors that are associated with loneliness, and we'll be looking at ways that we can overcome loneliness. And these are just a few of the important topics that we'll be examining in this chapter.
What do you think about this statement? Close relationships are a paradox in that they have both positive and negative aspects. Do you think this is definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected definitely true, you are right. We're going to be looking at relationships in this chapter and what it is that we seek in a mate. And we're going to be looking at what ideal relationships look like. In other words, the ones that are most fulfilling. But regardless, relationships do have both positive and negative aspects. And so close relationships can be thought of as a paradox. What about this statement? What do you think? Physical attractiveness plays only a small role in initial face-to-face encounters. If you selected mostly false, you're right. We're going to be taking a look at what the research has to say about physical attractiveness and the potential role it plays in seeking a mate. We'll be looking at possible gender differences in what males and females tend to look for when they're seeking a mate. And we'll also be taking a look at some of the other factors that contribute to what we look for. We'll look at the role of biology, the role of learning, the role of culture. So a lot of interesting topics will be covered in this chapter. What do you think about this statement? Women tend to be more romantic than men. What do you think? Is this definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected mostly false, you're right. Actually, for the most part, men do tend to be more romantic than women. We're going to be looking at what the research has to say about this as we look at this topic in this module. And here's one more. What do you think about this statement? Virtual or online relationships can be just as intimate as face-to-face relationships. What do you think? Is this definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected mostly true, you're right based on what the research has to say. You're going to be learning about the differences between online or virtual relationships and those that are face-to-face relationships, and what factors contribute to the development of those relationships. Before we get started, I'd like for you to take a moment to reflect. So there's some controversy over the value of doing scientific research on love. Do you think that this is a legitimate or valuable research activity, or do you think that maybe this is a topic that's better left to people like poets and songwriters? Well, I'd like to say that while psychological science has been pretty slow to develop an active interest in love, the past few decades have seen a lot of growth in research in this particular subject. But attempts to understand love go back much further in history than the most recent psychology studies of the past century. So most popular contemporary ideas about love can actually be traced to classical Greek philosophers and before. So prominent in this regard is Plato's Symposium, and it's a systematic and seminal analysis whose major ideas have probably influenced contemporary work on love more than all subsequent philosophical work combined. So as we think about research on love, we may wonder, what is the practical use? What might we want to study? Well, we might think about studying how culture shapes the experience and expression of love. So, for example, although passionate and companionate love appear universal, it's apparent that their manifestations may actually be moderated by culture-specific norms and rules. And we're going to be taking a look at something called Sternberg's triangular theory of love that encompasses these three components of love. We can also think about studying the role of hormones and neurotransmitters and the regions of the brain in love. So, for example, it might be important for us to be able to distinguish passionate love from companionate love. So, in other words, from like lust and other feelings of love. So, other feelings that a person may have that aren't related to those more passionate feelings. And having this understanding can be important for a key reason, for many key reasons, actually. If we think about the intrinsic process of identifying the brain and body regions in which love occurs, that's of course interesting and can be very illuminating, but identifying neural and hormonal circuits in our bodies that correspond to particular experiences and behaviors can allow researchers to sort out the different types of phenomena that are associated with love into what we might think of as natural categories. So, for example, as we think about the different forms of love, as we think about, for example, commitment, as we think about the role of passion and intimacy, and there are many different combinations of these different aspects of love that you're going to be learning about, understanding the different regions of the brain or the biology behind these can help us to better understand love itself. It can also help us to understand some of the different functions and different behaviors and the different consequences of these different feelings that we have. So, for example, if we understand love and we understand what's going on in the body, then maybe we can better understand the health effects of love. So, it's actually been speculated, or it's actually been, even there's research supporting this, that there's a lot of benefit to having an intimate relationship, to having a committed relationship. And we're going to be looking again at these different elements of love, but having these different components present seems to have some positive health effects, both physical and mental health effects. So, for example, there's actually been some recent research that suggests that marriage is linked to health benefits. So, we want to understand, it's beneficial then to understand what is going on in the brain and the body when a person experiences love, so that we can understand why there are these beneficial health effects. And are there additional things that we can do that can mimic or mirror those things that are, or those changes in our body associated with love that can also have health benefits? And when we think about the positive functions of love, we might also think about how important it is for us to think about some of the very negative aspects. Really, we could think of the dark side of love. In other words, the problems in love and love relationships that can sometimes be a significant source of feelings of despair and some really very devastating behaviors like homicide and suicide, and then also some of the major and more minor emotional disorders that a person may develop because of the negative consequences of a love relationship ending. So doing research on love can have many different beneficial or positive consequences for us. It also, as we can think about just practically speaking, understanding love is going to be very important for people who are couples therapists. So understanding the different components of love, the dynamics of love, how love develops, the effects of love, um, and many other things related to love can be very important as someone is helping a couple who may be struggling in their relationship. So these are just many of the potential benefits of understanding love relationships. But certainly psychology is not the first field to have been studying this. We can go back in history to the Greek philosophers, but we can also go much further back in history, and we can look at some of the Eastern philosophies and really gain some insight into their interest in understanding those feelings of love that are fundamental to us as people. So we're going to start off by looking at the question, what is it that contributes to the development of relationships? So for example, what do you think? Is there such a thing as love at first sight? Well, actually, believe it or not, it seems that there is. Before we get started, I do want to point this out, and you'll see this in your textbook as well, this idea of love at first sight. But there was actually a study that was done a few years ago, and it was an international study that was done by a researcher named Northrop and some of his colleagues. And he found, and his colleagues, that nearly 50% of men in their research reported experiencing love at first sight. And there's been later or subsequent research that suggests that more men experience love at first sight than women. And I wonder, why do you think that might be? Why do you think more men might be reporting this? There's some speculation that it may be because women have been shown in the research to be more selective in who they might date. And so we're going to actually be looking at why women do seem to be more selective. And you're going to be looking at this from a biological standpoint. And by the way, speaking of love at first sight, what do we mean by love? So we have to really understand, what is this idea of love? And when we think about love, we're going to be looking in a later video at Sternberg's triangular theory of love, and the qualities that are known to reflect love that are associated with Sternberg's theory actually are intimacy, commitment, and passion. So again, you'll be learning about that later in this module. And it actually turns out, when we think about love at first sight, that even if we just think about this logically, we know that the level of intimacy and commitment that a person feels towards another is certainly not going to be the same at first sight than it would be among those who have been in a relationship for some time. So, the extent to which people in relationships report feeling intimacy and commitment and passion towards their partners seems to far exceed the reports of those emotions by people who experience love at first sight. So it seems that when we think about love at first sight, maybe it's really not the love that we're typically thinking about. And so we have to define what love is, and also define what love at first sight is. And so maybe as we think of love at first sight, maybe this is not so much love, but maybe it's passion. Maybe it's a strong pull or an attraction that makes someone particularly open to the possibilities of a relationship. So, what are you going to be learning about in this particular video about relationship development? Well, you're going to be learning about the typical characteristics of close relationships and the paradox of close relationships. You're also going to be learning about the roles of proximity, familiarity, and physical attractiveness in initial attraction. You're also going to be learning about what's known about the aspects of physical attractiveness. And you'll learn about something called the matching hypothesis, and you'll learn about attractiveness as a resource. You'll also be learning about the roles of reciprocity and similarity in getting acquainted, and some commonly used relationship maintenance strategies. And then finally, you'll be learning about interdependence theory and how rewards, costs, and investments influence our relationship satisfaction and commitment. So let's get started.
The term close relationship is often used, but it's rarely defined. And certainly people have an implicit feel for what a close relationship is and use the term often. And when the term is used, no one really asks, well, what exactly do you mean by closeness? Instead, when asked to name types of close relationships, people tend to point to friendships and romantic relationships and family relationships. Yet these are just labels. And the very same people who point to such relationships as prototypical close relationships often may not even hesitate to add that they're not close with their own particular people in their family, like their sister or their mother. And so there seems to be this conundrum here in defining what is meant by close relationships. For purposes of this chapter, as we examine relationship development and different types of relationships, we want to think about close relationships as those that are important, interdependent, and long-lasting. Close relationships arouse intense feelings that are both positive and negative. And this is the reason that intimate relationships are so difficult. They are balancing acts. Every committed relationship carries with it the fear of hurt or betrayal due to the vulnerability and the fear of potential isolation or loneliness. And so these two intense, very different feelings that are or different poles of feelings that are both positive and negative is known as the paradox of close relationships.
Before we move on, I'd like for
Before we
you to
take a
take a
look at the
moment to
research
reflect.
on why
What
we
do
choose
you
the
look
mates that we
for in a
do
potential
and
mate?
what people
So
tend to
take a
look
moment
for
just
in
to
a
write
potential
down a few
partner,
of the
I'd ask you
qualities
to
that
take a
you think
moment to
are most
reflect on
important in
yourself
seeking a
and think
mate.
about what you might
And
look
then
for in a
ask
potential
yourself,
mate.
why do you think
What
you've
are those
listed these
features that you think
qualities?
are important?
What role
And
do you
then
think
why do
your
you think
upbringing
those
has
features
played
are
in this?
important?
How do you think culture has influenced what you think is important in a mate? What role do you think biology plays? As we look at what the research suggests about influences on mate selection, what I'd encourage you to do is to think about the various familial, cultural, and biological factors that might explain these preferences.
In an international survey of over 200,000 participants, researchers wanted to know what it is that men tend to consider the most important when seeking a mate and what women tend to consider the most important. This international survey included participants who were both heterosexual and homosexual and were men and women. So as you can see here, there are some differences in what men rated as most important and what women rated as most important. So if you look at the top four, you'll notice that men thought that intelligence was the most important overall, whereas women thought that humor was most important. Now, second for women was intelligence, which is not far, of course, from number one. So this is still in a top three in terms of most importance. But what I think is really interesting is that we see here some differences. And one particular difference is that for men, they ranked good looks as second. And for women, they ranked good looks as eight. And I, of course, you'll note some additional differences as well. I'd like to take a moment and reflect on good looks or physical appearance. And you can also see here that number five, men are ranking attractive face as fifth, and for women, it's ninth. So I would ask you, what do you think is the reason for these differences? Do you think that there is some biological predisposition that men have to seek a mate who is physically attractive, and that's something that is going to naturally be more important to a man than it would be for a woman? Or do you think that there may be something going on related to learning? Could it be related to observational learning? Could it be related to media messages? While we're talking about people who are in cultures around the world, I can't help but wonder if we would tend to see the same sorts of images in the media related to physical appearance, and that in films, I think I know in American films, you tend to see that leading women are often physically attractive. There are always exceptions, but you tend to see that happening more often than you do men. It seems as though for men, that men who are in leading roles are not always physically attractive. And it seems to be that happens more often than it does for women. So I would have to wonder, is Is that happening in different parts of the world? And places I've been, and I've been to several different countries. I have not been to anywhere in Asia. I have not been to Africa, but throughout, I've been to many places in Europe, and I've been to as far into the Middle East only as to Turkey, which is still not really in the Middle East. And the television's programs that I've seen and the films I've seen, I could say that I think it's still true, what I've observed, that women tend to be much more physically attractive in film and more frequently attractive than men do. And so I wonder, are there different standards? And then does this then play out in terms of what men think that they would find most desirable? Or is there something else going on? So I think these are interesting questions for us to ask ourselves. Think about images you've seen in magazines, and think about the standards of beauty that women have to uphold often, or at least feel as though they have to uphold. Does this then affect how women or how men think about relationships and what is desirable? Or again, is there something biological, or are there other aspects of learning that are playing an important role here? This is just something for you to think about, and we'll be looking at some of the theories related to attraction and what the research has to say. And there's some very interesting ways of thinking about attraction that involves both biology, or I guess we could say our nature and our nurture. There are three factors that underlie initial attraction between strangers, and I have two listed on this slide. And on the next one, I'll describe the third. So let's take a look at the first one, which is proximity. So proximity is important because we are more likely to become involved with people who are geographically close or spatially close to us. So in the upper left-hand corner, I have an image of an older dormitory. And the reason I have this image is because there was a very interesting study done many years ago where researchers wanted to know what it was that contributed to the development of friendships among students who were attending college. And was it because people who developed friendships developing these friendships because of similarities that were between them? In other words, did they have similar majors and similar interests? Were they from similar places? Or was there something else going on that caused them to become friends? And what was very interesting in this study is they discovered that the most important factor related to whether or not people became friends in this study was the proximity within which they lived to one another in the dormitory. In other words, the closer that a person lived to another person, the more likely they were to become friends. So here we see proximity as being important. I want to point out too that when we think about attraction, we tend to think about sexual attraction and the development of romantic relationships. But we're not just talking about that here. We're also talking about the development of friendships in this chapter. And so that's, I think, important for us to think about that this concept of proximity and the other concepts, some of the other ones that we're going to be looking at, do play a role in friendship. And I'll be pointing out those very specifically. So another concept or another term that's related to attraction is familiarity. And this is because of the mirror exposure effect. So it turns out that proximity is important because we become familiar with the person. And familiarity is important because of something known as the mirror exposure effect. So what happens is that the more we see a person, the more we tend to like that person, the more familiar we become with that person, in other words. And the reason that this connects to proximity is because we're more likely to see people who live close to us, whether it be geographically or just spatially close to us, like in the case of a dormitory. So think about people who tend to get into relationships or become friends. They tend to be people who see each other pretty often. Oftentimes, and this is anecdotal, but I think this is a nice way to tie this into what the research has to say. Think about people you know who are in relationships. in committed relationships, married or in some other form of commitment, or just friendships. And oftentimes it came to fruition because of frequently seeing that person. What's really interesting is that this mere exposure effect is so powerful that when we first meet someone, we may not even think that we have an attraction towards that person or that we're interested in a relationship with that person. But the more we see that person, the more we will tend to like that person. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, I think, that's related to attraction. Now, I do have another image that's here in the bottom left-hand corner, and this is one that's not listed in your textbook. It's related to a concept not listed in your textbook, but I wanted to bring it up because it's one that's very interesting. And this is an image of people who are going across a bridge that is obviously it's going across it looks like it's going across water, probably not very safe. And when you go across a bridge like this, you might feel a little bit scared. And so I bring this up because it turns out that when we are in a scary situation or one that is very exciting, what happens is we tend to look around and notice who's around us, what's going on around us. And as we look to those other people, we then define our physical experience by what we see in front of us, or who we see, I should say. And so if you are, you're going across this bridge and you're feeling that sympathetic nervous system arousal, and then you look over and there's the person you're on your first or second date with, you logically know that you're going across this perhaps scary bridge, but you look at that person and you may attribute some of those feelings to that individual. And if you think about sympathetic nervous system arousal, like an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure, an increase in adrenaline, some of those things that we have that our body does when we have sympathetic nervous system arousal are related to the feelings that you get when or that you had when you first met your significant other, or when you're attracted to another person. So we look to that other person, we label that particular physiological experience as being tied to that individual. So we could also tie this to drinking caffeine. If you were out on a date with someone and you drank, you had coffee and you had maybe a lot of coffee, you look to that person and you have that sympathetic nervous system arousal, or at least what feels like it. You have the increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, and so forth. And so you look at that individual and you then label that physiological experience as being tied to them. So this, I think, is interesting. So if you go on a date and you ask your significant other, or your potential significant other, I should say, to order you decaf, you might want to be careful and make sure that they actually do order you decaf, because if they don't and you drink caffeine, you may unintentionally attribute those changes in physiological arousal to them and not to the coffee that you're drinking. I have another image here, and that is of two people this looks like an image from the 1970s, but I thought it was, a nice example of something that is related to attraction, and this is the concept of similarity. And it turns out what the research says is that we're more likely to become attracted to or become interested in someone who is more similar to.
Let's take just a brief moment to reflect. So this chapter discusses the importance of proximity and similarity as factors in interpersonal attraction. Do you think it's possible that these factors go together in the sense that people who live and work near you are likely to be similar to you as well? Can you think of some examples from your own experience that might support this notion? So, do you think that this might explain in part why people who live and work near one another are more likely to form relationships than those who don't? And why do you think this is? let's take another brief moment to reflect. So, based on what you've learned so far in reading your chapter, there seems to be a widespread agreement across cultures on what constitutes an attractive face. So, I wonder what you think. What kinds of facial features do you think are associated with physical attractiveness? Why do these features make a person more attractive? I wonder too, what role do you think the media plays in influencing what we think is attractive? Do you think it plays any role? Or is it, if you do think it is, how big is this role that it plays? And I wonder, how important do you think our biology is in influencing what features we think are attractive? And how would we study this? How would we know the role that biology plays? We'll be looking at this. So let's take some time now to look at what the research has to say about this.
So let's look at what makes someone attractive. So there seems to be some underlying biology going on here, and that you could go anywhere in the world and you would find that regardless of skin color, regardless of hair color, hair texture, regardless of use of adornments, in other words, going to different cultures, the things that people might wear, the styles that they have, you would find some cross-cultural similarities in what people find physically attractive. So I have here an image of a very famous soccer player, and you can see here, this is David Beckham. It's an older picture of him. And in this image, I have placed a picture, or not a picture, but like an overlay of a mask. And this mask was created by plastic surgeons, or a couple of plastic surgeons. And the reason that they did this was they were trying to figure out what it is that you could do to a face to modify it to make it most physically attractive. Yes, I know that sounds shallow, but we're going to take that information and that insight that they gained and apply it to our understanding of our biological predispositions. So this mask is based on something called the golden ratio. And the golden ratio is a ratio of, I think it's 1 to 1.618. And if you were to take and measure each of these lines, you'd see that there's a ratio of that 1 to 1.618 among each of these different lines. And so you also note here that there's symmetry. And so it turns out that you could actually place this mask on different faces, and you would find that the more easily a face fits in the mask, the more attractive the face is going to be seen as being, or thought of as being, by the viewer. And this is true regardless of the person's cultural background. Symmetry is so important in terms of physical attractiveness, and so too is this golden ratio of 1 to 1.618. Now, this is not to suggest that this is the most important feature related to why we choose the mates that we do, but it is something that's listed at least as a top 10 among both men and women. And it seems that if it's cross-cultural and we have met, most of our genes are the same among people around the world. There's very little genetic difference, that we are it's very likely we're biologically wired to like facial symmetry, and that there's some underlying reason for this. You could even look at babies, and research with babies has found that they tend to spend more time gazing at symmetrical faces than those that are non-symmetrical. This is outside of the context of their own mother or father or whoever their primary caregiver is. There's no one more beautiful to that child than their parent or their caregiver. But in terms of just people outside of that relationship, that facial symmetry is very important. It's actually thought to be related to good genes, and that the more symmetrical your face is, the better your genes are, and therefore then if you mate with someone who has facial symmetry, the healthier your offspring are going to be. And so from generation to generation throughout human history, this tendency may have been passed on because it has promoted survival and reproduction. Also, you can see here that for women, baby face features are thought of as attractive for, that's how heterosexual men tend to look at women, that they see that, large eyes, small nose, combined mature features as well is thought of as being physically attractive. And for men, heterosexual women find a strong jaw and broad forehead more attractive. What's really interesting too is that during ovulation, women tend to be find these features in men to be even more attractive. So among heterosexual women during ovulation, they are even more attracted to men who have a strong jaw, broad forehead, broad shoulders as well, and deeper voice. And so we could think about why that might be. I'll let you reflect on that. I'm sure you can conclude why that would be biologically. Why would it be that women would find that attractive? How would those features help her and her potential offspring to survive? What are those features associated with? If each of us could design our ideal body, what would it look like? And how do we develop these ideals? And how close do our bodies come to them? And does that even really matter? When we think about female bodies that have been glamorized in Hollywood or in magazines and on social media, and also male bodies that have been glamorized, it seems to be that for females, it's always been a very skinny frame and a large chest. And for men, especially when we think about men who are playing roles that are very like dominant roles, or perhaps like superheroes, you see very broad shoulders and a slim waist. Well, according to a study that was published back in 1997 and then in 1998, and there have been since many experiments that have really confirmed this, that women with a low waist to hip ratio, commonly known as an hourglass figure, they're seen to have the most attractive bodies. And if you look at this image here that I have, you'll see that this waist to hip ratio, I have several different ones that are provided. It's the 0.7 that most consistently was seen as being the most attractive. And it may be because this waist to hip ratio is an indicator of optimal fertility, and some suggest that it may be an indicator also of sexual maturity in young women who have not been pregnant. So when we think about the biology behind this, we can think about, if a woman has never been pregnant, perhaps biologically, she's not going to be diverting her resources, her time to a child who is not the man's that she may be in a relationship with. And so it might be in his interest to seek that woman out who appears as though, at least historically, and of course modern day, things are very different. And our genes are the remnants of our ancestors. They don't necessarily line up with what's going on in our culture and the cultural shifts and changes that we've made. But historically, it would have been in a man's interest to mate with a woman who only has had children, if she has, it would have been with him. But especially, he would be most interested in someone who hasn't, who's going to be in a relationship solely with him and hasn't had children with someone else. So perhaps that may be one reason. And then, of course, optimal fertility. And so he's going to be interested in mating with a woman who has the indicator of fertility. For men, what women seem to be most attracted to is those broad shoulders, slim waist. I mentioned that a moment ago, that women are most attracted, especially during ovulation, to men who have deeper voices, who have broader shoulders, even a more angular jawline. And as some of you might have reflected as I asked the question of why, you might have thought about how that may be related to testosterone. And so higher testosterone levels perhaps may be tied to greater levels of ability to be aggressive and to defend. And so although today that may not be needed, again, we have the remnants of our ancestors' genes, and perhaps then we are making these choices, or at least we feel these preferences because of our human history. I think it's also very interesting to note that there's often a very distinct discrepancy between what women think is attractive, and more specifically what women think men think is attractive, and versus what men think is attractive themselves. And I'm speaking specifically about heterosexual men and heterosexual women. And so it's interesting because in many studies, researchers have found this discrepancy, and that women may find or come to believe that a waist to hip ratio closer to 0.4 or 0.5, as you see in B, is most attractive, when in fact that's not the case. And if you go around the world, we see that many cultures have different, there are many different preferences for what the size or the overall, how large a woman is. Is she very thin? Is she more voluptuous? So there's variation around the world in terms of what's thought of as being most attractive among men, but you consistently see that regardless of how thin or how voluptuous the woman is, that having that hourglass figure is going to be what is seen as being most attractive. Additional factors that are related to physical attractiveness include expressive traits like a large smile and high set eyebrows. And these are seen as attractive perhaps because they suggest friendliness. And then grooming qualities are also desirable. So grooming qualities, of course, those can include things that you may do each morning, like combing your hair and brushing your teeth. But then this also can include things like cosmetic enhancements. And if we look at the amount of cosmetic surgeries, they have been on the rise. And the image that is in your textbook is a little bit dated. So I want to share with you some of the more recent research and what that suggests in terms of frequency of cosmetic procedures. So I found some interesting information on it's called the Plastic Surgery Statistic Report. And this report is put out by the American Society of Plastic Surgeons. And in 2019, the top plastic surgery performed was breast augmentation. And there were almost 300,000 breast augmentations in the United States. Second was liposuction. Third was eyelid surgery. Fourth was nose reshaping. And fifth was facelift. And of course, there are minimally invasive procedures as well, which can include number 1, Botox, number 2, fillers, number 3, chemical peels, and number 4, laser hair removal, and then 5, intense pulse light. And so what's interesting is that there are very high rates of cosmetic procedures. In Botox, we're talking 7.7 million procedures. Now that doesn't mean 7.7 million individuals, because people will go repeatedly, but still that's a very high rate. And what it tells us is that and this is, of course, can include men as well. This report is not just including women. This is including men as well. And so what it tells us is that people who are, clearly there is a demand that people feel that they, or at least there is a perceived expectation that people have of themselves to look a certain way. And where is that coming from? Is it because of is it because of learning, what they've seen in the media? Is it because of messages that they've received from, growing up? Is it that our biological predispositions as men and as women have affected what we expect to see or what we want to see in a potential partner? And therefore, does that affect the motivation that individuals have to modify their bodies in some way? So when it comes to physical attractiveness, the matching hypothesis suggests that people of similar levels of physical attractiveness tend to gravitate towards one another. I want to expand on this a little bit, though, to share with you that the matching hypothesis actually also goes beyond this. And it suggests that we also are likely to gravitate towards people who have similar demographic characteristics, and also personality traits, attitudes, and values. And so this is related to the concept of similarity. And similarity plays an important role in which we select our friends and our romantic partners. During the initial phase of forming a relationship, when two people haven't yet become good friends or committed partners, they tend to assess the extent to which they resemble one another in their demographic values, in their demographic background, their values, their interests, their personality, and then in perhaps at some level their physical attractiveness, but certainly in those other areas they may be consciously assessing those things. And so this perception of similarity may promote feelings of mutual support and a rapport and a positive sentiment between two people, and the expectation that further interaction will be rewarding. There's a lot of evidence, a lot of research evidence that supports this, that supports the matching hypothesis. And we often do tend to end up with romantic partners and friends who are similar to us. This does not mean, though, that people don't ever end up with people who are not similar. They certainly can, and you probably know people who have. But what the research suggests is that we do tend to be most attracted to people who are similar to us. Perhaps it also, as I said a little while ago, can in part be explained by mere exposure. We're more likely to see people who are similar to us, and we're more likely to see them often. And that frequent exposure tends to breed liking of the other person. Resource exchange theory is an evolution-based theory that proposes that in heterosexual dating, males trade occupational status for physical attractiveness in females. So when we think about historically what men have found attractive and what women have found attractive, so we're talking about heterosexual men and heterosexual women, what they have found attractive. Heterosexual women have found that men who are able to provide, who are strong, who are able to acquire resources, are those that are more attractive. So it's not so much what the man physically looks like as much as it is, and that's of course it's something that's a factor, but it seems to be what has outweighed that is his ability to provide for the woman and her children that she potentially has with the man. Now, we're not talking about today necessarily, although we do see the remnants of this today. We see this today in human behavior and mate preferences. But if we go back in human history, what we would see is that women would have had that. They would have been more interested in men who could provide. And the reason was because life was not like it is today. Times were more dangerous, and also it was harder to acquire food, and it was harder to survive. And so women would have been taking care of the child, and the man would have been acquiring food for the family, and often going out and hunting. And so this would have required physical strength and agility. And so the man who could do that then would be able to acquire those resources, provide it for the child and the woman, and then that child would be more likely to survive than the child whose father was unable to provide those resources. So it was in the woman's interest then to seek out a mate who was able to do those things. For men, historically, they would have been not as interested in, if a woman could do those things as much as at all, really, historically, but they would have been interested in things like her ability to be nurturing and caring, and then also her physical attractiveness and her beauty and her youthfulness. So youthfulness being associated with fertility, and also physical beauty being associated with good genes. So resource exchange theory is saying here that in heterosexual dating, males are trading occupational status. So that's not so important according to this theory, because of our past as human beings. And so I have an image here of a peacock, and the reason I have the image of the peacock is because if you've ever seen peacocks, the ones that are the most beautiful, they are the male peacocks. So the males are known for their brilliant jewel-toned plumage, like you see here, that show off their, you see here the sapphire and emerald colors that are, what they're doing is they're showing off these assets to the female. And the peahens, they inspect the peacocks before deciding whether or not to mate with them. And this, it's unclear. It's difficult to know. Just as an aside, it's unclear to researchers exactly what it is about this plumage that the peahen is looking for. But the point overall here is that the peahen is looking for for this indicator of that male's health, of the male's ability to really to show to the peahen what they have, what they're offering. And actually, if you look at this image of the peacock, you'll see here those circles, and those circles that are multicolored and really beautiful if you've ever seen the peacock in person. And it's thought that the stronger the immune system of the peacock, the more of those circles, those beautiful circles with the colors that the male will have in his train of feathers. And so healthy peacocks, the male peacocks, they spend a lot of time showing off their trains to potential mates. And females are drawn to peacocks that have more of these circles and who display them for longer. Maybe because those females stand to have offspring that will inherit the father's increased resistance to disease. And so perhaps the more that this male peacock has of these beautifully colored circles, and I don't know exactly what they're called, but the more that the male has of those, the better his chances of mating successfully. So I bring this up as a parallel because this is the indicator for the female of his good genes. This is the indicator that her offspring are going to survive if she mates with him. So ask yourself, what do men, even today, do to provide indications of good genes and to provide indications that they can provide and care for offspring? I'm certainly not saying that that's necessary or that that is something that is aligned with what our culture expects of men and expects of women. But when we think about human beings and we think about our genes, culture it moves much faster than than changes in a gene pool. And so we see a conflict almost between what's in our gene pool and what's going on within our culture. So it may not line up, but it can help us to understand the behaviors of men and the choices that women make. And I think this sort of epitomizes what we're talking about here. On 1 second before the blind date, what she's thinking and what he's thinking. And if you've ever seen a show, there's a show on Bravo. I don't know if it's still on, but I remember a few years ago it was, and it's called Millionaire Matchmaker. And the premise behind the show is that you have men who are millionaires and women who are young and very physically attractive. They have to meet certain beauty standards. They're interviewed by the person who is like who's a matchmaker. And the millionaire, his physical appearance isn't really that important. What is important is that he can verify that he's a millionaire. Now, the matchmaker works with both of them to make sure that they're doing things that are going to attract the other individual, to attract a mate. But this really sort of boils down to this sort of primitive way of thinking about mating. Now, you may agree with it, you may disagree with it, and that's not really, I think that is interesting for us to think about. What are our thoughts about that? Are we fighting against our biology, or is our biology not aligned with what we as a society expect and value and want in the individual relationships that we have and choose? So interesting things for us to think about. So all of this ties into what's called parental investment theory. And this argues that mating patterns, like the value of status and physical attractiveness in men versus women, they depend on what each sex has to invest in terms of survival. So for men, reproductive opportunities are the most important. So they show more interest in sexual activity and physical attractiveness. Women are going to be more inclined then, based on this theory, to choose mates that will supply resources that are needed to support offspring for many years. We can also look at additional behaviors that are tied into this. Men are more inclined to engage in more frequent sexual activity. Think about the investment that men actually have in the act of sexual activity and the outcome versus women. So a man theoretically can have a really huge number of children. And it's not, well, yes, there are legal ramifications today. If you go back historically, that wasn't really the case. It wasn't even the case until pretty recently, when you could, at least the case, almost 100%. Not that you would get money necessarily from the father if you were able to prove he was the father, but at least today we do have DNA testing, which allows which allows the woman to prove that the man is in fact the father. Whereas historically that wasn't the case, and the man could have reproduced and not stayed around, and there would be no real implications. So not much investment. Whereas for women, if she were to become pregnant, there's a tremendous investment. The investment in physical resources, the increase in energy that she has to consume, the potential danger to her health and her well-being. If we think about, mortality of pregnant women, this is still a problem in many developing countries, and even in developed countries, there are women who do not survive pregnancy because of very serious health conditions associated with pregnancy. But go back before we had well-developed medical interventions, and you would find that that being pregnant was really a very risky scenario for women. Now, today, mortality rates for pregnant women in the United States are not nearly as high as they were historically. About 15 women will die in pregnancy or childbirth per 100,000 live births. But if we were to go back to even just the go back to the 1600s and the 1700s, the death rate was much higher than that. And some estimates suggest that it was 1 to 1.5% of women who died giving birth. So to get pregnant was really a risky situation, and it required a lot of resources, a lot of calories, a lot of energy, a lot of commitment to a woman's own health and her baby's health and well-being. And then we have to think about after birth, the commitment to historically for women breastfeeding, the amount of physical energy required for that, and that she was very vulnerable as a woman taking care of a child, vulnerable to the environment, and vulnerable to something happening to her because of, today we don't have to worry about those things, but go back a couple thousand years ago. If you're not if you're not really vigilant, if you weren't vigilant at that point in time, you could have been in harm's way. It could have been more dangerous for you. So when we think about how much energy is invested in pregnancy and the time and the risks, we could then see why women, and we can look at the research, are actually more selective when it comes to mate selection, and they engage in they tend to have fewer sexual partners. Now, part of this could be biological, of course, and then part of it may be cultural and the expectations from society. Perhaps those two are interrelated with one another. Then we can think about for men, and they have virtually an unlimited number of opportunities to reproduce. And while today in the United States, the infant mortality rate while it is still higher than many other parts of the world. And if you look at I think it's like the World Fact Book put out by the US government, you'll find that the infant mortality rate in the United States in 2017 was 5.8 deaths per 1,000 births. Now, believe it or not, this is actually quite a higher rate than many other places in the world. Just to give you an idea, and this is just a sort of a side note, I want to give you an idea that we are 170th in terms of infant mortality rates, and it's the higher your number, the better your rate is. But there are countries with much lower rates than ours. going all the way up to 225. And these include places like, of course, Italy and Luxembourg and Belgium, but it also includes Belarus, Estonia. It also includes Liechtenstein and Taiwan and Cuba. Of course, they have very different healthcare systems than we do. They have very different, there are a multitude of reasons for that, the infant mortality rate in the United States being higher than it is in other parts of the world. So that's just a side note. But I want to point out here that that's a pretty low infant mortality rate, even still, that we have compared to what you would have seen if you were to go back in history and you were to just go back to when people were coming to the United States and the risk of peril that they faced when they came here. And, there were, in some instances, the death rates would be among infants, 40 to 50% of children would die because of viruses and diseases and during certain periods of time in human history. So it would have been in a man's interest then to mate with as many different women as he could have, and perhaps to be less selective. But so you can see here then the role that our biology and our human history may play in the preferences and behaviors that we engage in today. But this is only part of the story. There's a lot more to the story than just our biology. Figure 9.3 does a nice job summarizing this for you. You can see here the biological reality for males is reproduction involves minimal investment of time, energy, and risk. And the evolutionary significance is maximizing reproductive success by seeking more sexual partners with high reproductive potential. And so this leads then to more interest in uncommitted sex, a greater number of sex partners over the lifetime, looking for youth and attractiveness in partners. Whereas for females, reproduction involves substantial investment of time, energy, and risk. And then they would be motivated to maximize reproductive success by seeking partners willing to invest in material resources for their offspring. And so then we would see behavioral outcomes that would include less interest in uncommitted sex, smaller numbers of sexual partners over the lifetime, looking for income, status, and ambition in partners. These are certainly generalizations when we think about behavioral outcomes, but these trends are supported in general in the research, but they can be explained by other lenses that we might look through as well. And so there are also environmental variables that play an important role in the mates that we choose and the behaviors that males and females engage in, both heterosexual and homosexual, in relation to mate selection. And we'll be exploring those in future chapters, in the next 2 chapters. What I'd like for us to take a little bit of time to look at now are the factors that affect the viability of relationships. So one important factor is reciprocal liking, and we like people who show us that they like us. So we can show people that we like them by just showing interest in them, by asking questions, by wanting to spend time with them, by through self-disclosure. So we share things about ourselves, which is showing that we trust and likely like the other person. What's also interesting is that reciprocal liking can even be shown through your physiology. So when we like someone, when we're attracted to someone, we show an increase in pupil size. And so we don't pick up on this consciously as we look at another individual, but we do notice it at some perhaps unconscious level. If you go back in history and you look at the Egyptians, you would note that Egyptians, both men and women, would do things to make their eyes appear much larger. And actually, when they did this, they were drawing attention to their pupil and making their pupil appear larger. In addition, in history, not too long ago, in the past just few hundred years, you'd find women who would take something called belladonna. And belladonna at high doses would actually poison or kill a person. But in low doses, it would cause pupil dilation. And women would do this because they believed it made them appear more attractive. So why does it make them appear more attractive? Is it that heterosexual men are looking at women and saying, you have large pupils, therefore you're attractive? Or is it that it's an indicator of that that person likes you, and we like people who like us. Think about candlelit dinners. Candlelit dinners, when the lights are low, they cause dilation of pupils. That's a natural way of making a person look more attractive. Of course, you're also reducing the glare from all of the lighting that would show potential imperfections, but you're also, making those pupils appear larger. Another, we talked about this, is similarity. We are drawn to people with similar qualities, and this is true of friendships and romantic relationships, regardless of sexual orientation. And similar attitudes play a key role. We also note that desirable personality characteristics are important. So for future spouses or for life partners, personal qualities are more important than physical traits.
I'm sure all of you have heard the expression opposites attract. And this basically suggests that people who are very different from one another may be attracted to each other. So, in light of the discussion in the chapter of the importance of similarity and attraction, why do you think it is that opposites may be attracted to each other in some cases? Are we drawn to others maybe out of needs and desires that are unfulfilled in our lives? Like maybe we have a desire to experience greater connection, security, love, support, or connection. So maybe we're more open to being in a relationship with someone who has a lot of differences from us because we have those other things with them, or we see the potential for those other things. And so we feel that those things are important more than the differences are. Or maybe do some of these unfulfilled longings have to do with extreme opposites, like maybe someone who is very adventurous and maybe the potential partner is not. Maybe there's a lot of the person may take a lot of risks and the potential partner may not. Maybe that person may be very intense and the other person's not. So is it that there are some unfulfilled longings that the individual might have and they find that or those features in that other person? So I do want to say that while the research supports that birds of a feather do flock together, it seems that maybe some opposing needs and interests can produce passion, and that this may actually sustain and even deepen some relationships. So, as you've read your textbook and what you're learning so far is that the research suggests overall that we are more likely to be attracted to and to pursue relationships with people who are more like ourselves. And this is across a broad range of personal characteristics. So, as you've learned from your readings, this includes things like age and religion, political orientation, and even certain aspects of intelligence. So generally speaking, it appears that birds of a feather romantically flock together. But here's the question I think that's important for us to ask. Are they happier in their relationships? I think this is a curious question. And actually, there's been some research to examine or answer in attempts to answer this question. So in one study, what researchers wanted to do is they wanted to know whether couples that are more similar in terms of personality are more satisfied than those who are dissimilar. So what they did is they recruited couples who were in romantic relationships and they gave them a battery of different tests. And they gave these tests to them several times over the course of a year. And so they gave these tests, they were giving them repeatedly. So about once every 2 months, they gave these tests to the participants. And so these couples were predominantly heterosexual couples. There was one gay couple and one lesbian couple. And so overall, though, there were 174 couples. So this is really telling us about heterosexual relationships. And keep that in mind as we look at relationship research. There are many gaps in the research when we think about the research on relationships that are not heterosexual. So that's something for us to think about, and we don't want to assume that every single relationship is the same, although we're going to find that there are a lot of similarities, but there's definitely a gap in the literature. It's a great opportunity for some interesting research that can be very helpful. So in this particular study, what they found was that the participants were in exclusive relationships, so most of them were, and just a few of them, so almost, a little over 90% of the participants said that their relationship was exclusive, and then the rest said that it was more of a casual relationship. And the relationship length of the participants was from a little less than a month to 7 years, and the average relationship length was 17 months. And so I think this is obviously, when we look at any study, we want to know who was in the study, what types of characteristics did those people have, and these are important variables for us to think about. And so what they used for this study is they measured their personality by assessing those big 5 personality traits that you learned about in the second module. So remember, those are things like extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, which is the opposite of neuroticism, and openness to experience. And then what they did is they asked the participants to complete a measure of relationship satisfaction. And what they found is that they found that partners who were similar to each other in terms of agreeableness and who were moderately similar in terms of emotional stability were more satisfied in their relationships. But as they looked at the traits of extroversion and conscientiousness and openness, these factors, these traits didn't predict relationship satisfaction. So it seemed that sharing similar personality traits didn't necessarily mean that the relationship was more satisfying. So what they found in this study is that was very interesting, though, is that people who were in a relationship and perceived themselves as being similar reported having more satisfying relationships, regardless of whether or not they were actually similar. So perceiving that they were similar seemed to be important. So what we're going to be looking at in the next video is we're going to be looking at the concept known as attachment. And so I want to just give you a little bit more information about this study, because that's what these researchers did, is they looked at attachment. And so attachment fundamentally shapes how people function in romantic relationships. And attachment, as you've learned perhaps in Introduction to Psychology, is an intense reciprocal relationship that is commonly found between an infant and a caregiver. And we'll be looking at this again in a video here, probably actually it is in this module. So in the next video, you're actually going to be looking at this. And so again, attachment fundamentally shapes how we function in romantic relationships. And so what these researchers wanted to know is whether adult attachment styles influence the association between partner similarity and relationship satisfaction. What you'll be learning in this module later is that, again, attachment develops from the relationship between infants and their caregiver. And there's 2 very important components to attachment, and that includes responsiveness and availability. And what you're going to learn is that the effects of early attachment are far-reaching, and they have an effect on how we perceive ourselves and how we see others as we grow into adults. And so, in broad terms, people who experience as infants and young children loving and consistent early caregiving develop secure attachment. And then those who receive harsh or inconsistent treatment from their early caregivers can develop insecure attachment. And so insecure attachment breaks down into 2 types. So you have those who are high on attachment avoidance, and they believe that other people are not going to respond to their needs. And so they tend to have a negative view of others, and they tend to avoid intimacy. And they feel uncomfortable when they feel like their partner is too close. And people who are high on attachment anxiety, that's another type of attachment. And they're preoccupied with how available other people, their relationship partner is. And this can have, and they also tend to have a negative view of themselves. And so they seek out intimacy and they seek out contact with others. But what happens is that they can be very needy and clingy in their relationships. Now, securely attached people are very low on attachment avoidance and anxiety, and they tend to show higher levels of adjustment in their relationships. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background here because what the researchers in this study found, and so what they did, remember, they examined personality and they were examining relationship satisfaction. And then they added to it a measurement of attachment. And what they found was that highly avoidant people seem to be most satisfied with their relationships when their personalities of the people they were in the relationship with were moderately similar. And so the researchers thought that this may reflect sort of a level of counter dependence where avoidant people are comfortable with that. And so, in other words, that perhaps there's an optimal balance of similarities and differences that may help avoidant people to keep intimacy at bay. So those avoidant people who don't want to be close to one another, they like moderate similarities, because if you have moderate similarities, that's enough of a similarity that you don't have to be too close to the other person. But for very anxious people, those people who are very anxiously attached, there was a very different story that was taking place. So what they were experiencing were greater levels of relationship satisfaction when their partners were either very, very similar or very dissimilar to themselves. And so what could be going on is that similarity may be offering anxious people a feeling of oneness that they crave with their significant others. And then dissimilarity may encourage sort of a reliant dependence on their partner. So for people who are anxiously attached, having a dissimilar partner may be a way to compensate for their own shortcomings. So overall, could we say that opposites attract? Well, it's much more complicated than that. So perhaps we don't really need to be looking at, do opposites initially attract, but we really need to ask, what does this do? What is the relationship between similarity and happiness? So it's actually been said that, the happiest couples never have the same character, that they just have the best understanding of their differences.
So, what is it that we can do to maintain relationships? And you can see here that this was many years ago where college students were asked to describe how they maintained 3 different personal relationships over a college term. And their responses were grouped into different categories. And you can see that some people would behave negatively to enhance relationships. Some of you may know people who do this. They may behave in a negative way to enhance relationships. And then also you note here that openness was the most commonly nominated strategy. And it turns out that self-disclosure is an important feature related to intimacy. So when we want to be close to another person, self-disclosure is important. Self-disclosure, though, really requires that we have trust in our own ability to understand ourselves and what we're sharing, and that we can trust the other person. And then, of course, there needs to be a balance in self-disclosure. Also, the investments, we look at the investments, and these are things that we contribute to a relationship that we can't get back if the relationship ends. So investments go beyond those things that are tangible. Investments can include things like shared friends, maybe you have not only shared friends, but you have shared social groups, or you both go to the same church, or you have a close relationship with your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your husband or your wife's parent or aunt or uncle. Those are all investments. Children are, of course, investments. Shared property, those are investments. So one reason that perhaps people, after so many years, typically you hear of around 7 to 8 years, people tend to stay together. One potential reason is because of shared investments. This is not to suggest that all people are staying in unhappy relationships simply because of investments. But certainly this is an important factor that people take into consideration, that the relationship is not just about the other individual. It's about all those things you share together with them. And if you look at the figure in your textbook, here we have the key elements of social exchange theory and their effects on a relationship. So we have the rewards minus the costs, which equals the outcome. And then we compare that to what we may think we should have, or what we have had in the past. And this then affects relationship satisfaction. And then this then affects our level of commitment. Are we going to stay, or are we going to go? These are certainly not the only variables related to commitment. There are multiple other ones we'll explore in the next chapter, but these are some important variables.
Let's take a moment to reflect on the strategy of playing hard to get. So what do you think of this strategy? Have you ever used this as a strategy with another person, or do you think that someone may have used this strategy on you? Do you think it's an effective strategy? And if you do, why do you think it's effective? Or if you don't, why do you think it's not effective? So I'd encourage you to reflect on this, and I'd also like to share with you what some of the research has to say. Keep in mind that each of us have our own individual experiences, and we have our own perspectives on a variety of issues. And I think this is especially true when we think about dating relationships or any committed relationship. But when we think about human behavior, it's so important for us to think about it from the point of view of what the research has to say. But then also, we need to think about how research has been conducted when we read about studies. And so, what I'd like to do is just share a little bit with you about what the research has to say about playing hard to get. So, the research suggests that men and women primarily play hard to get for two reasons. So one is to increase demand for themselves and make someone want them more. That sounds logical enough, right? And then two is to test a partner's level of interest and their willingness to commit. So I will add, though, that both of these motivations for playing hard to get are more likely to be held by people who perceive that they have a high mate value. So in other words, they think that they're a good catch. And that's so the research says this, that when people feel like they're a good catch, they are more likely to have these reasons for playing hard to get. And they're also more likely to be used by people with narcissistic or more manipulative personalities. Now, keep in mind, these are generalizations, and there are always going to be individual different experiences, but there's a lot of research supporting this idea that there are these two main reasons that people play hard to get. So then the next question is, does it actually work? What does the research have to say about the effectiveness of playing hard to get? Well, apparently, what the research suggests is that being moderately hard to get is important, or valuable. It actually is effective. But if a person is completely off limits, then this may not be very motivating for a potential partner to want to establish or maintain a longer term relationship. So being moderately hard to get, in other words, not being so easily available, but not being completely unavailable, that seems to provoke the most interest in that potential partner. Let's now take an opportunity for you to test yourself on some of what you've learned in this video and through your readings. So, what do you think is the correct answer? Close relationships are defined as important, blank, and long-lasting. Are they intra-dependent, interdependent, conditional, or unrequited? If you selected interdependent, you're right. So interdependent means that people are mutually reliant on each other. So people in interdependent relationships, which is a component of close relationships, having that interdependence, they tend to have a balance in how each individual's needs are met. So when we think about closeness, that means that both people are feeling close and connected. And that's where interdependence becomes an important part of that close relationship. Let's try another one. The blank is an increase in positive feelings towards something or someone new, just based on being frequently exposed to it. Is this the familiarity paradox, emotion as cognition paradigm, the mere exposure effect, or the payola effect? If you selected the mere exposure effect, you're right. And this is probably the most unromantic of all of the theories that are related to love, but it's an important one. And as you'll recall from your readings, the mere exposure effect refers to our tendency to like things that are familiar to us. So you learned about this in this video as well, that those things and people that we're exposed to most often, we tend to like more than those things we're not exposed to and people we're not exposed to very often. So this effect helps to explain the effects of physical proximity. So there's a very famous study that was conducted by a social psychologist named Leon Festinger. And some of you who maybe have taken other psychology classes may recall hearing that name. And so he and his researchers discovered that the development of friendships in an apartment complex was directly related to the distance between apartments. So people were more likely to become friends with neighbors who lived even just slightly closer, and those that they happened to pass more often on the way down the stairs, or maybe even to the mailbox. And while, of course, there can be some degree of randomness and even luck in some of the attachments we form. So for some of you, as you think about friendships that you have or committed relationships that you have, it may in part be due to some element of randomness. But this doesn't mean that relationships that are based on proximity are any less genuine or meaningful. And what it does do is this idea of proximity supports the idea or supports the notion of the mere exposure effect. And so remember that power of proximity is due to the mere exposure effect. So when we live near someone, when we work with someone, maybe attend the same church as someone, or maybe frequent the same gym, we're likely to see that person often. So there's that proximity. We live near them. They're geographically close to us, perhaps because we go to the same, and we then go to the same gym, go to the same grocery store. And then based on the research, this increases the likelihood that we're going to like the person and maybe even form a relationship with them, whether it's a romantic one or one that's based on friendship. Let's try another one. Which factor explains the tendency for us to like people who demonstrate that they like us? So if you selected reciprocal liking, you're right. And the basic premise of this is that people like you more when you like them. So for example, imagine you meet someone totally new and you have a brief conversation and then you both part ways. And at this point, you may not have any strong feelings about this person. But let's say that the next day you're talking to a coworker who says, "Oh, that person who came by yesterday was really impressed with you." Well, with just that simple piece of information, your opinion of that person radically changes. You're probably maybe even interested in meeting that person, maybe spending time with that person. You may then, because of that, be likely to develop a friendship with them or have some type of relationship with that person. So this idea is the idea of reciprocal liking is as simple as that. When our liking for other people is clear, then people are prone to return the liking. And this is very well supported by research in psychology. So, what can we take away from this? Well, the simple act of expressing your thoughts, and remember, we want to, of course, be sincere, not pretend that we like another person so that we get something. And of course, people do that, knowing this information. But basically, if you're expressing your thoughts about another person, that you do like them, this may be to your advantage in the future. Now, this doesn't mean that you should overstate your liking or insist that you like a person. So what the research suggests is that just a simple one-time statement can be effective. Here's another one. Over the years, which of the adages has garnered the most empirical support within psychology? More money, more problems. Similarity breeds contempt. Opposites attract, or birds of a feather flock together. If you selected birds of a feather flock together, you're right. Be sure to go back and read in your textbook about similarity. And as you'll remember, we spent a little bit of time on a reflection question, and I shared with you what some of the research has to say about similarity. Here's another one. Going out on dates, sending good morning texts, working hard to remember birthdays without social media reminders, and traveling to visit childhood friends are all examples of blank strategies. Are these attraction strategies, relationship maintenance strategies, persuasion strategies, or inter-exchange strategies? If you selected relationship maintenance, you're right. So keep in mind that people spend a lot more time maintaining personal relationships than they do developing them. And maintaining relationships can last decades. As you've learned, also there are important things that we can do to maintain relationships. So I'd encourage you to go back and look in your textbook at what you can do to maintain relationships. There are likely some things that maybe you haven't thought of, and each of us can always improve when it comes to relationships. Here's another one. This is a question based on readings from your textbook. How have researchers explained the finding that wearing the color red increases a woman's sexual attractiveness? Is it that red matches a woman's lipstick and thus enhances her appearance? Fashionable women have worn red clothing for decades. Red clothing is an evolutionary artifact related to sexual receptivity? Or is it that red stimuli are cognitively associated with excitement and danger? So which of these is the reason that wearing the color red increases a woman's perceived sexual attractiveness? And if you're not sure, I'd encourage you to go back and look in your textbook. If you think you know the answer, let's see if you do. So if you selected red clothing is an evolutionary artifact related to sexual receptivity, you're right. So I'd like to add too that in addition to what you've read in your textbook, there have been many studies suggesting that heterosexual women find men more attractive when they're viewed against a red background and in red clothing. So it seems that this is not something only true for men, heterosexual men and their attraction to women, but also women and their attraction to men. And there's another interesting study where researchers found that when women wore red, it prompted men to sit closer to them and to ask her more intimate questions. So there seems to be some power in red. And again, the reason is that this is thought to be related to sexual receptivity. And this is our last test yourself question in our video. Northrop and his colleagues in an international sample found that nearly blank % of men in their research experienced love at first sight. Is it 10%, 30%, 50%, or 70%? So I shared this with you in the video, and then you also would have read about this in your text. So which percent is it? If you selected 50%, you're right. So a little earlier in this video, you were asked to think about love at first sight. And as I mentioned, you'll find this in your textbook as well. And so in an international study, they found that 50% of men report experiencing love at first sight. But remember, we reflected on what does this mean? Does this mean that When we think about love, are we talking about the fullness of love involving intimacy and commitment and passion, or are we talking about more along the lines of passion? So we're going to be looking at love in more depth later in this module, and we'll parse out those different components of love, including passion, intimacy, and commitment. So what have you learned about relationship development in this video? Well, you've learned about the typical characteristics of close relationships and the paradox of close relationships. You've also learned about the roles of proximity, familiarity, and physical attractiveness in initial attraction. You've also learned what is known about the aspects of physical attractiveness. You learned about the matching hypothesis and attractiveness as a resource. You learned about the roles of reciprocity and similarity in getting to know another person. And you also learned about some commonly used relationship maintenance strategies. And then you also learned about interdependence theory and how rewards, costs, and investments influence relationship satisfaction and commitment.